So when you look at the Old Testament, you get Genesis through Nehemiah is the whole Old Testament story, and then everything after that fits in between those. Well, when you get to the New Testament, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Who is Jesus? What does it mean to follow him? Then you have the acts or the actions or the practices of the apostles. What did the guys do that were the first generation followers of Jesus after Jesus left? And you can take the book of Acts and you can outline it either with the life of Peter or life of Paul. It's basically, there's a biographical outline. Chapters 1 through 10, typically Peter. 10 and following is typically Paul. Or you can do a geographic outline of the book of Acts. Jesus said, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. And you read the book of Acts, and you see what the guys who followed Jesus did after they left Jerusalem and what they taught. And you'll find they went to cities like Corinth and areas like Galatia. You'll run into people named Timothy. And then the rest of the New Testament are letters written by these first generation Christians, these mature spiritual guys, to immature, young, struggling churches to help them clean up some of their problems. The Bible is a problem-solving tool. And when you understand the problem that was being solved in that area, then you go, okay, if this was a problem in the city of Galatia, and I've got a similar problem, if I apply the same attribute of God or Christ to that problem, I can solve my problem. We defined last night that a problem is a lack of resources, and this is the ultimate resource. So when you get to the book of Romans, you have Paul writing a letter to a group of people he really has never met. And the problem you get when you get to the book of Romans, and typically when Paul writes to these churches that are struggling, he's going to address either Gnosticism, which is a false doctrine that basically said that what you do in your body doesn't really matter. It's only the spiritual part. So you kind of had this license to sin, or your body is so evil and so sinful you have to treat it harshly, so you can't eat good food and you can't have any fun. And so Paul's either going to address Gnosticism, he's going to address legalism, because the Jews were so busy interpreting the minutiae of the law, or he's going to combat Judaism, legalism, and racism. Just about every New Testament letter deals with one of those three things or one of those five things, and sometimes multiple of those things. When you get to the city of Rome, you have Christians in Rome who come from a Jewish background, people who grew up with the law of Moses, and then you have these people who became Christians and they don't know anything about Jewish traditions. They're the Gentiles. There's a book based on Carol Dweck's book, Mindset. Mindset is a book that talks about people who think they're smart, gifted, or talented, either academically or athletically, and people who have a fixed mindset, when that gets challenged, they fall apart. It's a really interesting book. I was reading it, doing some sports psychology, and there's a book written based on that talks about spiritual mindsets. It's called Cognitive Spiritual Development. It's about a 64-page essay on mindsets in the modern church, that there are people who think that they're modern-day Gentiles, modern-day Samaritans, modern-day Pharisees, or modern-day Sadducees. Pretty interesting little book. Well, that's what the book of Romans basically addresses. You've got these guys who were Jewish by nature. They grew up with the law of Moses, and then when the Gentiles came into the church, they said, yeah, you guys can be Christians, but you're not real Christians. Because you didn't have the law of Moses. You don't know anything about clean and unclean food. You don't circumcise your babies. You don't understand about Sabbath day or Yom Kippur or any of this stuff. And so, kind of tongue-in-cheek, the Jewish Christians made the announcements. They led singing. They had the keys to the church chariot. And although the Gentiles were allowed to come to church, they were kind of second-class Christians. Well, the Caesar decides, hey, I'm against Christianity, and he bans all Christians from Rome. Well, for the most part, they identified the Christians by, oh, this guy's a Jew. Christianity came out of Judaism, and so they kicked the Jews out of Rome. Well, you had a handful of Gentiles that stayed in Rome. We know the Caesar kicked Christians out of Rome because that's how Paul meets Aquila and Priscilla. But you've got this Gentile remnant, and so while the Jews have been banned, you've got this group of folks who are still in Rome who are Christians, and now they lead singing, they make the announcements, they have the keys to the church chariot. Well, when the Jews get to come back, the Gentiles go, hey, you guys had the kingdom, you guys had the Messiah, and you blew it. Sit down. We're in charge now. And so there's kind of this reverse discrimination. So Paul writes this letter to a group of Christians he's never met and says, listen, It doesn't do you any good to be a Jew. It doesn't do you any good to be a Gentile. You've all got a sin problem, and you can't solve that sin problem yourself. The only way to solve that sin problem is through Christ. And he does some really interesting stuff there. So when we get to this discussion, he's already talked about, hey, this is what it's like. This is how you solve your sin problem. And so we're going to get into Romans 5, and as we start Romans 5, he gives a therefore statement. And he'll kind of sum up what he said. Now, this afternoon, we're going to spend some time in Romans 8. I had all weekend. We do Romans 12, 13, and 14. Romans 12 is, what does a person who's spiritually mature and mentally healthy look like? That description is in Romans 12. Romans 13, how does a spiritually mature person interact with the civil government? In Romans chapter 14 is how do people who are spiritually mature get along with people who have different traditions. They're not doctrine, they're just traditions. They're things that you do that are not unscriptural, but they make me uncomfortable. How should we get along? But before we get to that, he does this kind of special thing because these people were used to persecution. These people have been used to suffering. So he starts in chapter 5, what the English Bible calls chapter 5. Therefore, well, based on the fact that it doesn't do you any good to be a Jew, it doesn't do you any good to be a Gentile, you had the law and you blew it. You didn't have the law and you blew it. You could see things about God from the things God created, and even though God's invisible, you could see his attributes from the things he created. If you can't look at creation until there's a God, okay, I'm going to say that's a special kind of stupid. There, I said it, okay? I mean, you've got to have one of two worldviews. You either have to believe matter has always existed or intelligence has always existed. There's only two positions you can have on the planet. Stephen Hawking, Richard Dawkins came up with a mathematical formula and said, we've proven mathematically that the universe is not eternal. It had to have a starting point. Even the two biggest atheists on the planet admitted there was a singularity, a place where things started. Okay? So you already know that the viewpoint that there's always been matter is wrong. But even if you're one of those people who still believe it, you've either got to believe that matter has always existed or intelligence has always existed. And if you believe that matter has always existed, then the minds in this room came from a rock. Or a mind created all the rocks and all the minds in this room. It's not rocket surgery. It's pretty simple. You just got to pick. So once it's supposed to be rocket. I know I do that on purpose. It's okay. Calm down. Don't put it in your notes. I get one every he said rocket surgery. Yeah, it's not rocket science or brain surgery. I got it, but I do that on purpose to see if you're paying attention. And you are. Nobody else is, but you are. Because you looked at your boyfriend, brother, some dude you randomly sit by at a youth rally. Okay, never mind. All right. So anyway, so Paul having this discussion, and he says, you've got to admit that there's a God, and you knew by nature there was a God, and you didn't do it. So no advantage to be a Jew, no advantage to be a Gentile. The only way you solve your sin problem is by God's mercy and God's grace and your faith. And that's where we pick up this discussion. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we also have access by faith into this grace in which we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Paul says, listen, I'm going to tell you some things, but I'm going to remind you that's what a therefore is. Anytime the biblical writer says therefore, he said some things. Usually with Paul, it's the indicative. If these things are true, therefore, then you get the imperative. If this is true, then this is how you have to act. If I were to say, hey, I smell smoke, I see smoke coming out from under the door, the fire alarm is blinking, I touch the door handle, it's hot. If those things are true, therefore we should exit the building orderly. That's an indicative and an imperative. So Paul has said some indicative things about grace and faith and mercy. He says, therefore, since we've been justified. You know what justified means, right? Basically add an extra syllable to it. Just as if I'd never sinned. That's how God treats you. God takes our sinful condition, and because of what Jesus did on the cross, not because you're a Jew or a Gentile, black, white, green, purple, rich, poor, tall, short, nothing you've done about yourself. Because of what God did, he can take a person who is guilty of sin and treat them just as if they'd never sinned. You're guilty but not punished. You're guilty but somebody already paid the price. My daughter has little tiny feet. She's 4'10", wears a size 4 shoe. She's the smallest person to ever play Division I volleyball. She's meaner than a one-eyed water moccasin. She got a volleyball scholarship. The same company that made Shaquille O'Neal's shoe made her volleyball shoes. Been a great commercial if they'd have just used her for it. But although that foot is tiny, it's heavy. And she drives that little used Toyota really low to the ground and fast. I've been a police chaplain for 32 years. If you graduated the Huntsville Police Academy in the last 32 years, you've had a class with me on stress management. You've come to my ropes course. You've tried to handcuff me in felony vehicle stops, and you've learned to clear buildings with me hiding in them. Or you've been to one of my jiu-jitsu classes. If you're a cop in Huntsville, you know me. I told my daughter, if you get pulled over for speeding and you use my name to get out of trouble, I'll murder you. She driving around Huntsville one day. She was in college, and she's flying low. Whoop, whoop. Young police officer, rookie cop, pulls her over. She got a little tag on the back of her car. Her name is Lonnie Elizabeth Jones. We called her Lonnie Beth, and the volleyball team started calling her LB. She plays a position in volleyball called a libero, and her number is 10. So her tag says LBRO 10. Her name, her volleyball position. I didn't buy that for her. Her grandparents bought that for her. Okay, I'm not going to pay for a vanity tag, but grandma and grandpa will. Anyway, so she gets pulled over, and this young cop runs her tag, and he doesn't know if the 1 is an L or the L is a 1. He can't find her tag. He says, young lady, I can't find your tag in the system. She says, well, I'm going to try to call my dad and find out if. He said, who's your dad? She said, I can't tell you. She said, well, you got to tell me who your dad is. She said, sir, I'd really rather not. So he goes back, tries to run it again, and they do this back and forth. Well, finally, this thing is taking so long, he goes, all right, you got to tell me who your dad is. She said, well, sir, my dad's Lonnie Jones. He dropped his ticket book, went and sat on the hood of his car, put his head in his hands. He come back and said, look, you got to go. I can't write you a ticket. She said, you've got to write me a ticket. He said, I can't write you a ticket. He said, please write me a ticket. I can't write you a ticket. Those SWAT guys will kill me if they find out I wrote you a ticket. But my dad will kill me if you don't. Please write me a ticket. So this is the opposite thing here going on. She's begging for a ticket. Well, I run into him at a store. I said, oh, so I understand you're just letting felons just roam the streets with willy-nilly. She goes, dude, there's no way your daughter's getting a ticket for me. Those SWAT guys will kill me. Well, she's guilty. She was speeding. But he let her go. Now, he fudged a little bit because nobody paid for that offense. You've got an offense, and Jesus paid for it. I ate lunch today. I ate breakfast. I've eaten 2 meals today and didn't pay for my meal. Just walked right out of the restaurant. Y'all be cool. Somebody else paid for it. If you're under 21, you still do that with every meal you eat. You go in, you eat steak, you eat pizza, and you later, and you walk out. Well, nobody yells, hey, you stole food, because somebody paid for it. You walk out of the restaurant just as if you paid. You've been justified. God punished your sin through his son. Therefore, having been justified by faith, and because of this justification, you now have peace with God. One of the saddest verses in the Bible is in Genesis when Adam and Eve recognize that they've sinned, and God comes to visit them, and Adam says, I hid, and God says, why did you hide? And Adam said, because I was afraid. You don't have to be afraid of God. You've been justified by faith. You have peace with God through Jesus Christ, and you have access by faith into grace, and you rejoice in this glorious hope. And hope's really what he's talking about here. Now, if we stop there, and it would be early and we'd be ahead of schedule. If we stop there, we've got probably the best information I can give you. You've been justified by faith. You have peace with God. You have access by faith into this grace, and you stand in hope. We could stop there, and that's the best news you'll ever hear. But notice what he says. Verse 3, and not only that. What do you mean, not only that? You ever seen an infomercial? Wait, there's more? This is what he's doing. Hey, look, you've got peace with God. You've been justified. You have faith. You have grace. You have access. You stand in this glorious hope. But wait, there's more. But not only that, but we also glory, we shine in tribulations. Fancy big word for crisis. Hey, because you're a Christian, not only do you have your sin problem taken care of, but you get a way to respond to crisis differently. Doesn't say you're immune from crisis. Doesn't say you'll never have any crisis. Doesn't say you won't experience crisis, but you can rejoice, you can glory in your tribulations. Why? Knowing that tribulations produce perseverance. Perseverance produces character. And character produces hope. If you want to know what the process of tribulation is, understand that when I encounter difficult things, those difficult things, when I endure them, that's what perseverance means, long suffering, suffering long. Endurance produces character, and that character produces this thing called hope. I believe in a principle known as intentional adversity. Intentional adversity is basically says, I will do things that you will not do, so I can do things you cannot do. And that's it. The only way to run faster is to run faster. I don't like to run faster. It makes my legs hurt, makes my lungs hurt. Well, if you only run at the pace that's comfortable, you'll always run the same pace. I wear a weighted vest. I run up hills. I do wind sprints. I goof around with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I'm not going to wrestle anybody that is older than me. I'm not going to wrestle anybody who's smaller than me. I go to that room and I teach that class. And what you do, you teach an hour of technique, and then you turn on the clock and you do 6-minute matches with everybody in the room. And that's brutal. But what we tell the young cops is, if you learn to wrestle for 6 minutes with the monsters that are in this room, the average person puts their hands on you out here, you'll laugh at them. We teach the 100-second rule. If one of these young men were to tackle me, not that I'm stronger or faster or better, I could cook him for 100 seconds. And after 100 seconds, he will beg me to handcuff him, I promise you. Because he doesn't have the cardio for it. We make these guys fight each other real time for 6 minutes. So when you get a hold of a guy for 100 seconds, it's like a walk in the park. I wrestle a kid at camp. I don't even untuck my shirt anymore. It's ridiculous. Doing things that you will not do so I can do things you cannot do. Spiritually speaking, when you encounter a difficult situation, you don't quit. You stay with it. And by the way, young people, that's the way you deal with anxiety. The only way to treat anxiety is not to avoid it or run away from it, but to deal with it. Because the only way to get comfortable is you learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And there's a Chinese proverb I really, really like. It says, do not seek silence. Learn to be at peace with the noise. And if I can be at peace with the noise, I can have silence anywhere I want. And so he says, listen, when you encounter crisis and when you encounter tribulation, because you're used to this tribulation, tribulation produces perseverance, the ability to stay in it, the ability to stay in the heat. Well, once you get used to, I have endurance and I don't quit just because it's hard. I don't quit just because it's not easy. I don't quit because it's scary. I stay with it. Once you learn that I can do this, it builds character. Character means, well, if I can endure that, I can endure that. If you can get out and jog for 5 miles, if you'll take 30 seconds off your pace, you can run for 10. It's a known fact. You can double the amount you jog just by simply deciding not to quit just because your lungs hurt a little bit. When I started trying to run with the SWAT team, and you can tell I'm built to run, I made myself a promise. I said, if I stop running, the pair of shoes I'm wearing, I'll throw away. And only twice in my life have I ever come back from a 5-mile run and taken a pair of Nike accelerators and chucked them over the fence. Because it's not worth throwing that pair of shoes away to stop. So I just keep running. Now, I've thrown up a little bit running, but I quit throwing shoes away. Perseverance produces character. Now, I can't outrun anybody in this room, but if I had to chase you, you better be willing to run for an hour. Because you'll burn me up in about 100 yards. But at about a quarter mile, you'll notice, hey, that little guy hadn't quit running yet. And you'll keep running, and that little old man's still running. Perseverance produces, I know how far I can run and at what pace and how long I can do it, because perseverance produces character. When you make a good knife, you take a piece of steel or a piece of metal and you put heat and pressure on it. When you put heat and pressure on it, something happens to the molecules in the knife. It's called tempering. On a Rockwell hardness scale, anything below like a 57 is too soft and it'll bend. Anything above 62 is brittle and it will break. But somewhere between 58 and 62, you've got a piece of metal that's almost indestructible. I've got an RMJ tactical tomahawk that I wear on my vest. And it's tempered metal. It'll chip through a brick wall. It'll go through Kevlar like a hot knife through butter. It's a piece of metal that a guy named Ryan M. Johnson decided to make a replica Cherokee Tomahawk, but instead of making it out of wood, he made one solid tomahawk out of one piece of steel. Pretty interesting little thing because it has perseverance, and that perseverance gives it character. Now, what happens when I encounter tribulation, I encounter crisis, and I don't quit, and I don't give up, and I don't stop? Perseverance produces character, and character, this idea that I've become something different, character produces hope. And biblical hope is really interesting. Biblical hope is not like we define hope. You know, I hope I see a big deer this year when I hunt. I hope I get this for Christmas. I hope I have ice cream for dessert. No. Biblical hope is the idea of an earnest expectation. It's not this is hope and faith are so close to one another. Faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. It's I expect God to be involved in my life. We were in Walmart one time, and when I go shopping, I have to have snacks. I'm like a child. So my wife makes me go to Walmart, and I have to have snacks. So we were in Walmart on the western side of Huntsville, and we were stopped at the Walmart had a McDonald's inside it, and I had a Happy Meal. And so we're sitting here, I'm eating my French fries, my daughter's there, my wife's there, and these dudes come in from the Limestone County Sheriff's Rodeo. And I live in Alabama. We don't see a lot of cowboys in Alabama. You guys are probably used to them out here. But these dudes walked in, and you could tell they were cowboys. Now, there's a lot of guys in Huntsville wear cowboy hats and boots and shiny buckles, and they're not real cowboys. These guys were legit, straight-up cowboys. The heels of their boots were scraped like they'd had them in the dirt, you know, roping animals, and their hats looked like they'd been rolled up and slapped against livestock. And one kid walked in, and you could tell he was a bull rider. I mean, you look at this kid, and he's a bull rider. My cousin in Kansas told me that if you look at the star on a spur, you got a pin in it so it won't rotate. That guy's a bull rider. Well, this kid wasn't wearing spurs, but I could tell he's a bull rider. He was wearing this T-shirt that said bull rider. Now, I'm a psychologist. I know these things about people. So he walks in, he got this cowboy hat on, he got these boots, he got this shirt that says bull rider. And then when he turned around, the back of the shirt said not if, but when and how bad. He understands his sport. I'm going to get on a 3,200-pound animal and go, nanny, nanny, boo-boo, you can't throw me off. Well, guess what? It's not a matter of if you get thrown off, but when you get thrown off and how bad you're going to get hurt when you get thrown off. I talked to a kid at another youth rally in Batesville, Mississippi, and he was a bull rider. He said, the third time I broke my elbow. Anyway, hope is just like that. Not if, but when and how big. Not if God's going to be involved, not if God's going to do something, but when God gets involved in my life and makes a blessing out of a curse, makes a triumph out of a tragedy. Not if, but when and how big. Now notice what it says. For we know that, verse 3, not only that, but we glory in tribulations, knowing that tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint. Earnest expectation. Because the love of God has been poured out into our hearts by the Holy Spirit that He has given us. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would dare to die. But God demonstrates His own love toward us in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. You understand that when you run into a crisis, my house got blown away, my diagnosis was positive, my parents divorced, somebody did something bad, I can't believe this is happening to me, and God doesn't love me. No, God's on record that He loved you. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more, and there's nothing you can do to make God love you less. God's on record that He loves you. And while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. God demonstrated His own love toward us. Now, you might find somebody that would die for a good man, and very rarely would somebody die for a righteous man. But God demonstrates His love for us that He died for us while we were sinners. You can't take your circumstances, the things that happen to you, and go, God doesn't love me. God's already on record. I love you. It has nothing to do with your health. It has nothing to do with your house. It has nothing to do with your cancer, your grades, your job, the economy. God says, I loved you when you were a sinner, and I sent my Son to die for you. I'm on record. So not only do tribulations produce perseverance, and perseverance produces character, that character is related in not if, but when and how big, because God gives us hope. And hope is that God has an unlimited resource that He's poured out in our lives. And that unlimited resource is His love. This may come as a shock to you, but most of the time as a guest speaker, people pay you. Now, I don't have a set fee for speaking at churches. I show up and whatever they do. I have a set fee when I do corporate work. I go spend 2 hours at Mazda Toyota doing a crisis intervention thing. They write me a nice check. I don't do that for churches. Churches pay whatever they pay. But for whatever reason, I think sometimes we're ashamed that we pay preachers. Because nobody ever just says, we thank Lonnie for being here and here's a check. You have this guy called the deacon in charge of the drug deal. You got this guy folds up a church check really, really little. And as everybody's walking out on Sunday morning, he kind of makes eye contact with you like, and you go, and then he kind of starts circling like Jaws. No. And he's shaking, you get caught up in it. Well, I got asked to speak at the Gurley Church of Christ, Gurley. Jim Ashworth was their preacher. Jim Ashworth is so old that there are people in heaven who think he didn't make it. Okay, Brother Jim's an old saint. And I did this thing, and we're standing in the back, and I'm talking to the brethren. This really tall dude starts circling. Start hearing the shark music. No, I said, that's the deacon right there. So, we kind of talk, and I separate. Well, I get home. And Jack said, well, how things go tonight? I said, well, I'm not really sure. She said, well, why are you not sure? I said, well, this weird thing happened. This guy gave me a check, and it was blank. And she said, what? I said, yeah, I got a blank check. I said, I don't know if I really did a good job or a really bad job. She said, well, what do you think we should do, pay off the house or pay off the car? Because I got a blank check. All I got to do is fill the numbers in. I said, I'll call Jim Ashworth and bug him about that. Next day, I waited for Jim to get up, and I gave him a call. Hey, Brother Jim. This is Brother Lonnie. Hey, Brother Lonnie. I said, I need to ask you about the check last night. Oh, what's the problem? I said, well, the problem is that it's blank. And my wife wants to know, can we pay off the house or pay off the car? And it's wise old Christian. Says, now, Brother Lonnie, if it's really blank, you pay them both off. Because if it's really blank, you don't have to choose house or car. You get to fill in the number. And hope does not disappoint because of the love of God has been poured into our hearts. God's given you a blank check. It's about His love. If God can save your soul, He can handle your cancer. If God can save your soul, He can handle your parents' divorce. If God can save your soul, he can handle your depression, he can handle your anxiety, he can handle the tragedy, he can handle the government. If God has the ability to take care of your sin problem, there's no crisis you can experience that God doesn't have the resources to handle. And the ultimate unlimited resource that God has is his love. And he's already poured it into your life. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more. There's nothing you can do to make God love you less, but how you respond to God is indicative of whether or not you love him back. And it's foolishness that when we have crisis that we reject God. The crisis is not indicative of whether God loves us or not. How we respond to that crisis is whether or not we trust the process that God put in place. We are justified, we have peace with God, we have access by faith into grace, and when we encounter crisis, tribulation produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint because the love of God has been poured into our lives. Thank you very much.